Συναδέλφισες και συνάδελφοι,
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. For another Sunday, we meet in the framework of our events, part of our work for against assessment.
Ναι. Μπορούμε να ξεκινήσουμε. Είμαστε εντάξει, μπορούμε να... επειδή έχω επιστροφή στον ήχο. Είμαστε εντάξει.
Can we start? Once again, there was a problem with the sound.
Στο YouTube πάντως φαίνεται μόνο το control.
Ναι, και εγώ έχω επιστροφή στον ήχο, δηλαδή δεν είναι αδύνατο.
Δεν ακούγεται.
Να το τσεκάρουμε γιατί υπάρχει επιστροφή σε όλο τον ήχο.
There is a technical issue with the sound. Trying to fix it. Give us a minute.
Νομίζω ότι έχουμε αντιμετωπίσει όλα τα
I
τεχνικά
think
προβλήματα.
that we have solved all the technical problems, so we will start. Dear colleagues, good afternoon once again in the framework of our internet meetings and the work of our sector against illegal assessment of teachers.
Ενάντια στην πολιτική της εμπορευματοποίησης του σχολείου, της μόρφωσης,
And against the downgrading of educator, the events of the Federation complementing our written paperwork on that. This is the fourth meeting for this year. Special education at the Crossroads, possible future paths. And we host Andrea Willis, Kent State University, and we have Mr. Anastasiou as a coordinator.
Υπάρχει κάποιος από την τεχνική υποστήριξη. Επιστρέφεται ο ήχος και είναι αδύνατο και να μιλήσω και να βγει ο ήχος προς τα έξω.
There is still a technical issue to be addressed.
Είμαστε να δοκιμάσουμε.
Να ξεκινήσω μία ακόμα φορά.
We will start once again.
Βλέπω στο chat ότι είναι κανονικά.
Ωραία.
People can hear us.
Λοιπόν, συναδέλφες και συνάδελφοι.
Dear colleagues,
ωραία. Μας συγχωρείτε για τα τεχνικά προβλήματα.
Sorry for the technical problems. We start once again.
Λοιπόν, Ξανά και πάλι καλησπέρα σε όλες και
Good
όλοι.
afternoon,
Για μια ακόμα
everyone.
Κυριακή συναντιόμαστε στο πλαίσιο
We
των
meet in the framework
διαδικτυακών
of
ΔΟΕ,
our
που εντάσσονται στον αγώνα του κλάδου
e-meetings
ενάντια στην αντιεκπαιδευτική
of
αξιολόγηση,
the
την κατηγοριοποίηση των σχολείων
Federation,
και
in
την
the
παραπλανητοποίηση της
framework of
μόρφωσης και την
our
παταγωγική
fights
απαξίωση της εκπαιδευτικής.
against
Εκδηλώσεις που
the
εντάσσονται στη
individualized
συλλογική απάντηση της
assessment.
Δασκαλικής Ομοσπονδίας μέσω των ενιαίων
Uh,
κειμένων στην εσωτερική και εξωτερική αξιολόγηση. Σήμερα πραγματοποιούμε την τέταρτη διαδικτυακή
Today
εκδήλωση
we
για τη
have
φετινή
the
σχολική
fourth
χρονιά με τίτλο «Ειδική αγωγή στο
event,
σταυροδρόμι».
and we
Πιθανές
focus on special
μελλοντικές πορείες
education at
με
the
βασικό εισαγγελέα τον
Crossroads,
αξιότιμο Άντριο
possible
Βουίλης,
future
καθηγητή του
paths.
Πανεπιστημίου
We host
Κέντ της Νέας
Andrea
Αγωγής
Willie,
και
Kent
συντονιστή το
State
γνωστό και αγαπημένο σε
University,
όλους μας Δημήτρη
and
Αναστασίου, καθηγητή
coordinator
ειδικής
Mr.
αγωγής στο Πανεπιστήμιο του
Dimitris
Ιλινόης. Το θέμα που
Anastasiou
προσεγγίζουμε
from the
σήμερα
University of
είναι κρίσιμο και
Illinois.
δομικό, θα λέγαμε, για την
It
εκπαίδευση
is
στη
a
χώρα μας.
structural
Γιατί η
and
ειδική αγωγή και
critical
εκπαίδευση
issue
βιώνει
for
πολύ πιο
our
έντονα
country
και
because
οξυμένα θα πρέπει να
special
αντιμετωπίσουμε τα πάγια
education
προβλήματα που απασχολούν συνολικά την εκπαίδευση.
experiences
Με τις
the
πολιτικές της
general
απαξίωσης, της
problems
υποστελέχωσης και της
faced
χρηματοδότησης,
by
της αποδόμησης και
education
διάχυσης στο όνομα μάλιστα της
with
συμπερίληψης.
the
Ένα τυχαίο και ειδικά τη
downgrading
φετινή χρονιά βιώνουμε
and
τα αποτελέσματα του νόμου για την
of
ειδική αγωγή που
this
ψηφίστηκε το περασμένο καλοκαίρι και οδηγεί βήμα το βήμα στην
sector.
αποδόηση των τμήματων ένταξης και τη
We are
διάχυση των ονομάτων
experiencing
ειδικής αγωγής.
the outcomes of the new law, which has downgraded special education in Greece.
Έχει, κατά πώς φαίνεται, πολύ βασικό στόχο τη μείωση των προσλήψεων σε εκπαιδευτικούς
As
παράλληλη
we
στήριξη.
see, the
Και αυτό
law
είναι, μπορούμε να πούμε, μόνο μία
provides
πτυχή των πολλών
for
προβλημάτων. Η
a
άλλη πλευρά
limited
είναι η τάση ιδιωτικοποίησης που εμφανίζεται
number
το τελευταίο
of
διάστημα
new
μέσω της παράδοσης της
teachers for
διαδικασίας αξιολόγησης
special
παρέμβασης για μαθητές και
education,
μαθήτριες προσχολικής αλλαγής
and
σε
there
ιδιώτες μέσω
is
των βάουτσερ και την υλοποίηση μάλιστα αυτών
an
των προγραμμάτων εντός του
introduction
δημόσιου
of
διαβατηρίου. Νομίζουμε
vouchers
λοιπόν ότι η σημερινή συζήτηση
for
μπορεί να συμβάλλει στον προβληματισμό που αναπτύσσεται γύρω από όλα
privatization
αυτά
of
τα ζητήματα
special
μέσα στα σχολεία,
education, especially in
αλλά και σε
primary
μια πιο
education.
αγωνιστική διεκδίκηση του κλάδου,
So we
που
want to
σίγουρα
touch
νομίζω πρέπει να
upon
δυναμώσει το
all
ερχόμενο διάστημα.
these issues,
Αγαπητές
trying to
συναδέλφες και
find
συνάδελφοι, πριν
solutions
δώσω το λόγο στον Δημήτρη
for
Αναστασίου για να συντονίσει την
equitable
εκδήλωση,
special
θα ήθελα και μέσα από την
education.
σημερινή εκδήλωση να
Before I
εκφράσω εκ
give
μέρους
the
του
floor
Διοικητικού
to
Συμβουλίου της
Mr.
ΔΟΕ
Anastasiou for
την πολύ βαθιά μας
continuing
στήριξη
this
για το θάνατο μιας
discussion,
συνομιλήτριάς μας από τη
I
Θεσσαλονίκη,
would like
τη
to
Σοφία Σκεφτίδη.
express the
Ένας
condolences
θάνατος,
of
ένας
our
τραγικός θάνατος που συνδέεται
federation
με τις
for
συνθήκες εργασίας που
the
είχαν διαμορφωθεί στο
death
σχολείο
of
τους.
a colleague
Εκφράζουμε
who
ταυτόχρονα
has
τη θετά μας συλληπιτήρια
suffered
στην οικογένειά της
bullying
και στους
at
συναδέλφους.
school.
Το τραγικό αυτό γεγονός επαναφέρει με
This
έναν οδυνηρό
tragic
τρόπο
event
στο προσκήνιο την κατάσταση που έχει
brings
διαμορφωθεί στα σχολεία
in the
ως αποτέλεσμα της
limelight
διαχρονικής αντιεκπαιδευτικής
what
πολιτικής
is
όλων των
happening
κυβερνήσεων. Το
right
περιστατικό αυτό
now
δεν μπορεί,
in
νομίζουμε, να
school as
εγκριθεί ως
an
ένα μεμονωμένο
outcome
γεγονός.
of educational
Αντιθέτως, αναδεικνύει την
policies
αστυνομική πίεση, την εντατικοποίηση της
years
εργασίας μας,
old.
καθώς και το κλίμα
At the
φόβου, το
same
κλίμα αυταρχισμού που
time,
πολλές
it
φορές
brings in
διαμορφώνεται
the
όλο και πιο συχνά
limelight
στους χώρους του
this
διάγνωση.
climate of
Αποδεικνύει επίσης το
fear
γεγονός ότι οι
we are
κυβερνήσεις και το Υπουργείο
faced
Παιδείας
with. The
έχουν αφήσει τους
Ministry
εκπαιδευτικούς χωρίς
of
ουσιαστική στήριξη
Education
απέναντι
have
στις ολοένα αυξανόμενες απαιτήσεις
left
και πιέσεις της καθημερινής
the
σχολικής
teachers
πραγματικότητας.
without
Δυστυχώς, μέσα σε
support
αυτό το πλαίσιο,
in an
καλούμεθα ως
adverse
εκπαιδευτικοί να επιτελέσουμε τον
environment.
παιδαγωγικό μας
In
ρόλο.
this
Ένας ρόλος
framework,
που
we are
διαρκώς απαξιώνεται
invited to
πρώτα και
play
κύρια
an
από την ίδια την
important
κυβερνητική μάχη,
role,
από
which
την
is
στάση, από τις
distorted
επιλογές, από την τοποθέτηση του
by
Υπουργείου
the
Παιδείας, που
policies of
αποτελεί
the
μέρος
Ministry
του
of
προβλήματος αυτή η
Education.
πολιτική.
This
Και
policy
φυσικά,
is
ερχόμενος στο
part of the
σημαντικό γεγονός, δεν
problem. And
αρκεί
coming
μόνο η
back to the
διερεύνηση των
event
γεγονότων στη
I mentioned
Θεσσαλονίκη,
earlier,
και
we
αυτό είναι πάρα
don't
πολύ αναγκαίο, αλλά το πιο
actually
σημαντικό είναι νομίζω να
must
πάρθουν μέτρα άμεσα
investigate
που
the
στήριξη των
event per
εκπαιδευτικών
se, but
για να ανατραπούν
measures
αυτές οι
need be
απαράδεκτες
taken in
αντιεκπαιδευτικές πολιτικές
order
που
to
απαξιώνουν το
change
έργο και την αξιοπρέπειά μας.
these
Απαιτούνται μέτρα τώρα
unacceptable
με βάση τις
policies
διεκδικήσεις του
against
κλάδου
our
για την πραγματική στήριξη και
dignity.
προστασία των εκπαιδευτικών.
We need to be
Οι εκπαιδευτικοί
supported
συνάδελφοι
by
και
the
συναδέλφισες δεν είμαστε
government
αναλώσιμοι,
and
ούτε
the
πρέπει να μένουμε
ministry.
απροστάτευτοι στο δημόσιο
We need
υπόγειο.
to be
Το οποίο
protected
δεν μπορεί να λειτουργεί,
in
δεν πρέπει να
public
λειτουργεί ως επίτρεπτο να
schools
λειτουργεί πάνω στη δική
that
μας εξάρτηση και την εξουθένωση.
cannot
Εμείς
operate
λοιπόν θα συνεχίσουμε να
uh,
αγωνιζόμαστε για ένα δημόσιο σχολείο που θα μορφώνει ουσιαστικά τα παιδιά και ένα
in
σχολείο που πραγματικά θα στηρίζει σε όλα τα επίπεδα και μέσα από πολύ
difficulties.
συγκεκριμένες
We
δομές
need
τους
the
εκπαιδευτικούς,
government to
αυτούς δηλαδή που
support
αποτελούν
us
όρθιο στον
as
αγώνα. Και νομίζω
educators
ότι τα
and
συνδικάτα μας, στη
appreciate
βάση
our
αυτών των προβλημάτων,
work.
στη βάση αυτών των
Our
διεκδικήσεων, μπορούν και πρέπει να
federations,
οργανώσουν τον
in the
αγώνα μας με
framework of
απολύτως σαφείς
this
πρωτοβουλίες στο αμέσως επόμενο
uh,
διάστημα.
struggles need to underline the importance of hours in education and stop downgrading education. With these thoughts, we give the floor to Mr. Anastasiou to coordinate the discussion, in which we look forward to. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good morning from Illinois. We have 7 hours difference with Greece. I would like to thank ΔΟΕ, the Primary Teacher Federation, the BOD, the President, and all the BOD members for the invitation to coordinate this discussion. I would like to express my respect to the struggles of educators for a better school. It is always a pleasure to contribute to this effort and, of course, express my condolences for the death of Mrs. Christidou, a colleague of ours.
Hello, everyone. As a courtesy to the keynote speaker, I will speak English from now on. I'm Dimitris Anastasiou, professor in special education at Southern Illinois University. I would like to thank the Greek Primary Teachers Federation, DOI, as it is the acronym, once again, this time in English, for the invitation to be the moderator of today's discussion. During the presentation of Dr. Andrew Wiley, professor at Kent State University, you can submit your written questions in Google Docs. Actually, it's an Excel form. And after his presentation, the questions in Greek will be translated by me and delivered to the speaker. A few words about Dr. Andrew Wiley. As I said, is professor at Kent State University, a respected scholar in special education and in general education and educational policy. His work focuses particularly on students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and on understanding how schools and policy environments influence education outcomes for students with disabilities. Professor Wiley has authored and co-authored numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, contributing to research on special education policy, inclusion, and educational equity. His studies, he has examined how school context, poverty, political environments influence the identification and support of students with disabilities. Importantly, his work contributes to major policy debates in special education, including discussions and debates about inclusion, multi-tier systems of support, response to intervention, and the continuum of educational placements. Today, Professor Wiley will speak on special education at a crossroads, possible future paths, a topic that highlights the key challenges and choices facing the field of special education today. At this point, I would like to give a warm welcome to Professor Andrew Wiley. Andrew, my friend, we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
All right. I hope that everybody can see that, and someone will let me know. If not, Dimitris, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's here. I am going to talk about special education at a crossroads, and also what might happen in the future, depending on both external forces, but also what we choose to do as a field. And it is special education at a crossroads, but I think it is accurate to say that there are many crossroads. And I'm going to touch on some of the ones that I think are most consequential. And I am going to talk about the current moment, certainly in the United States, politically, and the kinds of challenges that we're facing right now. Some of these crossroads have been here for a while, but right now our political climate in the United States has made the situation rather dire. So I do plan to talk about that as well. And yes, I've been at Kent State University as a professor of special education for 17 years now. And I do want to thank, I'm not even sure if I wrote it correctly in English, but I do really want to thank the Greek Primary Teachers Federation, everybody who's attending to hear me talk. I do hope that what I say and what I share will be helpful for your thinking about the challenges and crossroads that special ed faces, special education. I also want people to know that I did work as a teacher for 12 years in schools. My career in special education started at a school for students with severe disabilities. I also, as Demetrius mentioned, I worked in a special school for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. But I also worked as an itinerant teacher, which means that I worked in a rather large school district, and I had a caseload of students with autism or autistic students. And so I would work all the grade levels. I also worked with across a variety of placements. And then finally, the end of my sort of 12 years as a teacher, I worked as a behavior specialist. And again, I worked with students and teachers across many schools, very large school district. And I just want to emphasize that everything that I say, I'm always mindful of the fact that we're talking about real teachers and real students. And I have tremendous respect based on all of my experiences and my thinking about how do we provide special education to students with disabilities. Great respect for all teachers. So I just want to thank everybody who was involved in that work. I am honored that I was invited once again, and thank you. And I know the speakers who have gone before me. These are big shoes to fill. These are really people who I consider to be giants in special education. I do not think of myself as a giant. I do think that I'm pretty good at following in the footsteps of people who I think have offered some really clear thinking and clear communication about special education and how do we make it work as best as we can for all students with disabilities. So Demetrius and I have written together. Jim Kaufman, who did pass away last year, he was also a professor in my doctoral program. And also when I earned my teaching degree, he taught the class in behavior management. Jim was a great friend and an incredible influence on the field. I'll be honest, he scared me when I first met him. A lot of people are kind of intimidated by Jim's direct manner. But once you realize how much he cared about the field and he cared about clear thinking, you realize, and he ended up being a very gentle and very kind soul. So that's terrific. Brian Cook is enormous in the field. He did work at Kent State before I came here, and now he's at the University of Virginia. Gary Hornby, I haven't met, just a little bit, but I know that he's been very influential, particularly internationally. And then Doug, I know Doug Fuchs spoke, but also his wife, Lynn, who also passed away. But she was literally one of our greatest scientists in special education. And there are so many more who have influenced my thinking. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of the things I talk about are things that you might have heard from some of these speakers, but I've also tried to forge my own path, often with Demetrius, to try to continue forward and think about possible future paths from the kind of thinking that I think these folks have had to share about special education. So when I share, and again, I'm glad that there's a question opportunity at the end. I hope that I'll be able to answer any questions that what I share, you know, raises. And again, I hope it supports really good, clear thinking about where we are and where we are going as a field. So in special education, there are debates and there are controversies, and I'm sure that for people who are listening here, you may not agree with everything that I have to say or how I've thought about our crossroads and our future paths. I do think it's really important for those of us who are in the field of special education to recognize that we do have a shared goal. I've never met anybody who, deliberately or overtly, I may change this a little bit later on, is really trying to undermine special education. I really think that even though there are passionate disagreements and there are debates, we have a shared goal of better ensuring that special education is equitable, fair, and just, and also that special education is high quality. In the invitation to speak today, these are the things that were emphasized. And I want to be clear that everything that I am suggesting or offering in terms of our crossroads and our future paths is about how do we do that? How do we go from where we are and go towards being more equitable, more fair, and more just for students with disabilities, and also ensuring high quality. And I think that one thing that is really challenging and challenges a lot of people when they think about special education is the meaning of fairness, right? So we often talk about this in the classes that I teach, that often people will think of fairness as everybody is treated the same. But obviously there's something different involved when we think about providing special education, which is not general education, which is treatment that is different in some ways because it is individualized and it's targeted towards needs that are different. Well, the term that we'll use is exceptional or exceptional children. So I'm sure that a lot of folks here have thought about that. But what we do need to be really careful to be clear about, what do we mean by equitable and fair and just special education? So as Demetrius kindly offered, and I've already gotten a preview of some of the questions, so I hope if I don't touch on some of the things that you're interested in my talk, that there will be an opportunity to discuss afterwards. I am very focused on the law, on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is still, for those who may be wondering, I'll talk about that in a minute, the current federal law in the United States governing special education. I've been very interested in the role of science and ethics and advocacy within special education. A lot of my scholarship is focused on inclusion and what it means, and also what is termed in the law the continuum of alternative placements, from special schools and special classrooms to resource rooms to general education. Also a term from the law, but also in the invitation, which was great, free and appropriate public education. What does that mean? And how do we better pursue it for all students with disabilities? Scholarship is focused on evidence-based practices, and a big focus, and especially something that's emerging for me, I've always been focused on supporting special educators, but thinking about where are we at a crossroads with that and where we might go forward. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit about today. I have scholarship on multi-tiered systems of support. Not going to be a major focus today, but I am absolutely happy to answer questions about what that is in the United States. And multi-tiered systems of support is an example of special education reform. I've put here a little bit in jest, but good ideas, what I would consider to be not so good ideas, bad ideas, good, bad, and the ugly, which is the name of a Western in the United States. So anyway, okay, so that's some of my scholarship. So we are at a crossroads. I'll talk about in a minute that we seem to live at a crossroads in our field, and what does that mean? But I do think that we are at a moment in time, certainly in the United States, but I also think internationally, where the direction that we choose, I really do believe, could lead to improving special education for students with disabilities. Revitalize is a term that Jim Kaufman has used, and it's a hopeful word. It means that we could make special education vibrant and respected and effective in helping. But revitalize suggests that special education's current status may be not so great. So, but I do think that our crossroads are we going to improve, revitalize, and strengthen special education? And then there are choices that I think could be made that might lead to the special education's devolution, becoming something much less effective, becoming devalued, and also diminishing its potential to achieve fair and just outcomes for students with disabilities. So at the heart of all of the crossroads that I'll touch on today is where will this lead us, right, at this particular crossroads? I point out here that the term crossroads has been used, and I won't read all of these publications, but going back to 1973, you can see scholarship on special education. The use of the term crossroads is pretty common, including this relatively recent one by Jim Kaufman and Demetris and John Magg, Special Education at a Crossroad. So across time in the United States, if you've studied special education in the United States, it can feel like we've been at a crossroad almost our entire existence. And that's something that I think we should pause and think about. Why is that? Why do we feel like we're perpetually at a moment where we have to choose one big consequential direction or the other? And I'd also note that internationally, this term is being used in a lot of scholarship. Here's an example of a publication from Ireland, one from India, one from Australia, also one from Britain. So here's this term. So I wish I was original in coming up with it, but it's the way that it's a metaphor that's been used quite often for thinking about where is special education right now and where might we go next. So I'm happy to come back to this, but I want to put what we would call the elephant in the room right up front. In the United States, we're at a very dangerous time for special education. I'm sure, sadly, many of you are aware of many of the things that have gone on publicly in the United States. And what we're seeing with the Trump administration as it relates to public education and special education, I just want to first emphasize that there has been a strand of conservative politics for a long time now in the United States that has always sort of dreamed of undoing public education, hostility to public education and other public services. And I'm going to say, very unfortunately, now this group has the levers of power in the United States. So right now, very much so, I think that special education, the way that it exists right now, is in what we would call the crosshairs. There are efforts to try to undo a lot of federal laws, but the federal law of special education in the United States. And you all may have also heard of one of the big things that's happened with the Trump administration is these ideological attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we've already used the terms equity, we've already used the terms inclusion, and you can imagine that in terms of a political climate, this is not a really good time, not a comfortable time for people who have tried to advance those things. And diversity in special education, as I think Jim Kaufman talked about, means some particular things that have consequences for instruction. But certainly, again, equity has a context in special education. And today we'll also talk about what is inclusion, what do we mean? I am in Ohio, Kent State is in Ohio, and we do have a Republican state legislature. So a lot of the things you may have heard about what's going on politically at a national level are also happening at our state level. And I find it very unfortunate. It really has put a lot of people, made people nervous. There are still people who are definitely talking out and engaging with their scholarship and moving forward. But I think that there is a climate here of being nervous about what the consequences are of talking about particular topics and things like that. So I would say that the particular attacks on special education, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, have come from what would be considered some of the more conservative political groups in the United States. There are still center-right. You're not hearing from them too much because they're being drowned out. But there are people that have what I would consider to be more reasonable kinds of conservative approaches to public education and special education. One thing that got a lot of attention in the last election where President Trump was elected is called Project 2025. It was it's a policy document written by the Heritage Foundation. When it got out and people knew about Project 2025, it was full of extremely unpopular ideas. And the people who were opposing Trump tried to, get it out there and say, hey, look, this is what the whole plan is for the Trump administration. And it was so unpopular that Trump had to say, nope, that's not me. However, once he got into power, and it may not surprise you to learn that this man doesn't always speak the truth, a lot of those policies that were in Project 2025 have come to pass. Now, I bring that up because there are some very specific things that are said about special education in this Project 2025 policy document. And there are things, again, we've heard for a while, but they've never been kind of mainstream or really, put in front of Congress as possibilities. And they include things like changing how special education is funded. That includes converting most of the federal funding of special education in the United States to formula grants, sending federal funding directly to school districts instead of state education agencies, giving states and districts much greater flexibility in how funds are used. And most of these reforms are very market-oriented, decentralized, a focus on, school choice and vouchers in private schools, and also this possible shift away from the structure of IDEA, which I'll touch on in a little bit. So it's what we would call a fraught moment for special education. There are many people who, when we've heard these ideas, have pointed out how bad they are and how much they would damage what progress we've made in special education. So for those who are wondering about the current political atmosphere, these are the things that are concerning people who advocate for special education and for students with disabilities. I am not going to go for a long time about what's wrong with school choice and sort of market-based reform and privatization of special education. I would point you to a paper by Demetrius and Jim, and I just pulled out a couple of quotes, and I have to take a look here because the windows are partly covering what I've written. But basically, you can, hopefully these have been translated so that everybody can read them. But there are many reasons why we can expect that privatizing and using vouchers and school choice are going to be particularly hurtful toward children with disabilities. And we see it in public education. There have been states that have, big school choice programs and vouchers. And pretty predictably what you see, because the amount of money that's being given to parents is enough to be a discount for parents who already have a lot of money, but it isn't enough for low-income families to choose the programs that they want. The other problem with the market approach to reforming special education is, the market is driven by profits and customers, and it opens up a much greater possibility of schools using sort of false information to try to lure parents in. There isn't as much regulation and there may not be as much accountability. In Ohio, the state where I am, this has been a problem for a long time, and it's a real challenge. But this is one that I would recommend that you read to look a little bit more closely at the many things that could go wrong should we go down this particular path. And I want to make sure to say that we do have a lot of vocal advocacy for the federal law the way it is, for special education, for students with disabilities. It's a challenging time because the federal law, the way that it's enforced is housed in the Department of Education, and the Trump administration would like to shut down the Department of Education, and they want to move special education into the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a terrible idea for many reasons. I put up this slide because I want you all to know that there are organized campaigns, there's a lot of advocacy, people are not falling for this, and there are a lot of people who are contacting their representatives and saying, we need to protect the federal law, we need to protect special education. And it's a strange time because there was a time when attacking special education would have been a big political, a really bad move. But we're in a very strange time in the United States where all kinds of bad ideas are getting attention when they probably should not. I'm happy to circle back to current political climate. The things that I'm going to talk about next are going to relate to it, certainly in the question and answers. But I think that even though this creates sort of even higher stakes for a lot of the crossroads that we're at right now, in some ways they represent crossroads that we've been at for a long time. But it's a really important time for the field to think clearly and communicate clearly about what special education is and how we serve students with disabilities. So I gave you that list of publications, and I suggested that one of the things that I hope that people will think about from this talk is that why is it that as a discipline or as a field, we seem to be perpetually at a crossroads? And there are a number of really smart folks, Barbara Bateman, who have talked about the perpetual issues of special education. And I think that by itself deserves some attention when we think about where should we go forward. These questions are fundamental to any field, and we keep having them about special education. And that itself is interesting. People will ask the question, why do we have special education? What is its purpose? Why do we need it? These questions come up from all kinds of different directions, people being critical or asking, what should special education be? All right, that's something that I'll touch on today as well. How should special education be delivered? Where? This has to do with inclusion in the continuum of alternative placements. Questions about who should deliver special education. Do we need special educators? Can general educators deliver special education? All important questions. And really, at the heart of what I hope I'm talking about today is which way should it go next? Again, we have tremendous external forces that are always things that we have to navigate. However, a lot of this depends on stakeholders, teachers, parents, policymakers, researchers, faculty, saying where should we be going next? So I hope that when I talk about some of these crossroads, it helps you think about which way is the right direction to go next. So when you think about why special education seems to be in such turmoil about some of its most basic questions, I think it's helpful, and Doug Carnine is a scholar who wrote in 2000 about education generally. He wasn't talking about special education, and he was talking about the difference between what he called mature professions and immature professions. And he gave examples of mature professions like engineering and medicine, law, and he talked about some of the things that characterize what we would call a mature profession. And for our purposes, I would say that a mature profession, yes, it has debates. Yes, it has controversies. They don't tend to be so fundamental to the functioning of that particular profession. But Carnine said that in a mature profession, the practice of that profession is guided by validated scientific knowledge. The people who practice that profession rely on methods that have been experimentally tested. There are clear professional standards developed by a professional body, not by the government, not by the state, but by a professional body that has a clear direction and a clear sense of what evidence-based practice is. And there's broad agreement about what effective practices are in that particular profession. The training of professionals is aligned with evidence unambiguously and reliably across different places where people are trained. These are hallmarks of what Carnine called a mature profession. Professional preparation teaches effective practices. When people graduate or complete a training, they know something, they have a competency that's going to enable them to better deliver whatever the purpose of the particular profession is. A mature profession has limited tolerance for untested fads. There are untested fads in every discipline, even something that we consider as mature as medicine, right, as scientifically based. However, they're not welcomed into the mainstream of most discourse. This is another challenge that we're having in the United States, unfortunately, but I won't go off on that side. But in a mature profession, there's limited tolerance for untested fads. And there's continuous feedback between research and practice. There's growth, there's dynamic change over time, all of it guided and informed by the best available research. So an immature profession would be one that is a practice based heavily on opinion or ideology. And, so anytime you think of a profession and you say, how do practitioners make decisions? What guides their judgment? What informs their decisions? Is it based on what they prefer, what their opinion is, or something that they like because of its, ideological character? And in an immature profession, methods spread without strong evidence. There can also be low consensus about effective practices. Competing approaches coexist without clear standards. Preparation programs teach conflicting methods, frequent fads and trends, and also weak accountability to outcomes. I think accountability to outcomes in special education is one of those moments where we also need to really think. We thought about what do we mean by equity, what do we mean by diversity. I think that one of the things that we need to focus on in special education is not just accountability to outcomes, because those are going to differ because of the nature of disability, but also accountability to effective practices. Even if outcomes are going to vary, do practitioners use methods that are based on the best available research evidence? And I think that that's a kind of accountability. It's complicated. I don't mean to say that it's an easy thing to say, but it's the kind of thing that might work well for special education. So I want to talk to you about 3 crossroads today, and I want to start with one that I think Demetrius and I have talked a lot about, but I think that it is one of the crossroads that sort of underlies the other crossroads, and it kind of underlies our challenges in terms of what I think would be a good direction to move towards being a more mature, a more evidence-guided, a more evidence-informed profession. And there are movements in special education that I think we need to think about whether or not they're going to move us forward or whether or not they're going to keep us stuck in some of these crossroads. And in that, I want to talk about what are the roles of ethics, science, and advocacy in special education and in pursuing high quality special education that is just, equitable, and fair. The second big one, and I've hinted at it, that it's a real thing for sure in our current political climate, unfortunately, but should we embrace or abandon the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is abbreviated as IDEA? And yes, this is being floated as a real possibility, and I want to talk through what might happen should we abandon it, and what are some reasons why we might want to revitalize our commitment to IDEA as a framework for delivering special education. And then finally, I want to talk about free and appropriate public education. And so that term is a legal term. It's a principle of IDEA. And I think that at the heart of some of the debates about placement and some of the debates about the roles of science and ethics have to do with, is free and appropriate public education the primary obligation of our field, or is it secondary? Is it secondary to some other things? And within that, I'll touch on these sort of crossroads within crossroads. Full inclusion versus alternative placements. I'll talk briefly about if we're picking free and appropriate public education as our primary obligation, what does that mean in terms of optimizing our knowledge base in the profession or in the discipline? And then importantly, it's not just is there research, but how do we take research and have it support special educators and support the students that they're working with? So I'll talk about some big ideas. I feel like this is a place where Demetrius and I are trying to build on directions we've been taken by, I think, giants of the field, and saying, what else can we do? If we want to not just survive, but as a field, we'd like to get better and stronger and more effective for the students and families we serve, how do we do that? And then the final thing is talking about, and this is really important in the United States, talking about having a system for sustaining high quality and equitable special education. I think these things are all crossroads that we face and crossroads that we would do well to think very carefully about. And this idea of crossroads within crossroads, my first slide had a maze, and that's the way that it can feel, I think, in special education. And I do want to emphasize that I applaud everybody who is a special educator who is trying to make special education better. I think it's hard to think about, right? So I don't think that it's just that we need to mature as a profession. I also think that there are some uniquely challenging things about thinking about special education. And again, I hope some of my thoughts are helpful in terms of that for all of you. So if our goal, which I said at the beginning, I think everybody, including people who may disagree with me or may disagree with me strongly, is to better ensure that special education is equitable, fair, and just, and that it is also high quality. And I will try to define that a little bit more when we get to the crossroad about free and appropriate public education. But a really important thing that I think we're wrestling with, and whether or not people sort of recognize that we're wrestling with, is what is the role of ethics in making special education fair and just? What is the role of science? And then what is the role of advocacy? So very basically, and I feel silly speaking to a Greek audience about ethics, and this is so I don't get myself in trouble, I'll keep it short and hopefully not say anything goofy. But ethics, broadly understood, ethics are the goals of special education and also the rules for how we pursue those goals. So again, ethics are about things that we talk about a lot in special education. We should. They're about maximizing positive outcomes, beneficence, maximizing benefit for students with disabilities, and also minimizing harm, right? So we do have an obligation to make decisions at the practice level all the way to the policy level that will maximize the benefit and minimize harm for students with disabilities who we serve. And then justice, which is fair and equitable distribution of benefits. So it's not just positive outcomes, but also do we have fair access to the services, for example, that special education provides? And so ethics are all about what we ought to do in special education. Okay, so it's our goal, and it's also the rules that guide how we actually pursue that goal. And it's absolutely critical. All special education should be constrained and guided by ethics and ethical guidelines. So what then is science? And I think that, as I'll talk about in a minute, I think the crossroads that we're at is that we've blurred any distinction between ethics and science, but we need to remind ourselves, what is the role of science in special education, and especially in advancing special education? Well, science and research informs and guides our pursuit of those goals. And science is about is questions, when ethics is about ought. What ought we to do? What ought we do? Well, in order to make ethical progress, we need to think about whether or not something is beneficial, or if it is harmful, or if it is equitable. So this is where we are going to actually test what the effects or outcomes are of particular practices on students with disabilities, or their access to services, or all of these things that we are concerning ourselves with ethics. I think one of the challenging things about science is that it is not black and white. It is not yes or no. It is about probability. So science helps us make sense of whether or not a particular practice is most likely to be beneficial. It does not mean that it's going to work every time for every student, but it is what is most likely to be beneficial and under what circumstances, right? So it's both probabilities, but it's also conditional. Like under these conditions, what is most likely to be beneficial? And this is all pretty abstract, but when we think about teaching reading, teaching math, teaching students social skills, helping students with behavior, what are the practices, okay? So an important thing to recognize about science then is that it starts with questions, and then it uses particular methodologies to try to seek the least biased and most objective answers. And we're going to talk about, where questions about bias, meaning, error, and objectivity in science has become contentious and has given us another crossroad to think about. But scientific inquiry, from my perspective, and these methods are a way to test claims. And science and research serves as a check against ideology, intuition, authority, tradition, superstition, and bias to avoid injustice and harm. And I think that when we devalue or disregard research, these are the things that tend to fill the vacuum. People have their ideological commitments, and so they believe that what they want to do is going to be best. Or intuition, that's always been a challenge. And it's not to say that intuition is always bad under any circumstances, but in a mature profession, we have to be careful to test our intuitions, right? If we think, oh, this is something that works for all the kids that I'm working with, well, what would research say about that? And we need to consider what more rigorous tests of something have to say. And I think a real huge danger that we need to think about with science is authority. I mean, there are people who, like me, come in with a piece of paper and some letters behind my name, and I might say just about anything. And I think an important thing about science is it doesn't accept authority. It says, is what the person who's saying is saying based on the best available evidence? And that's a really important function of science. I think if we become completely untethered from science, these are the kinds of things that might fill the vacuum. And these are all reasons why I think not only do we need to not abandon science, but we need to embrace it and understand its role. It's not the only thing. And I like the term for special educators to say evidence-informed practice. You still have professional judgment. You still have decisions that you have to make. You still have autonomy, but your decisions are informed by the best available research. And this is the role that science plays uniquely within the efforts to improve special education. And finally, advocacy is a really important part, and I think it creates some challenges for us because I just showed you advocacy under the current political climate. People have to speak out. People have to say, let's not do A, let's do B. Okay, so that's a really important part. And special education in the United States, I'm sure in Greece as well, came from teachers, it came from parents, it came from also researchers who spoke out and said, we need to do these things in order to promote beneficence and justice. And so advocacy is for laws and policies and rights and funding and resources and supports. It's interesting, though, and important to keep in mind that advocacy starts with answers. You don't go out and advocate for things where you're like, well, I'm kind of not sure. It's no, we really need to do this policy, or schools really need to adopt this practice. So it has this sort of complicated relationship to science that I think we just need to be aware of. And I would suggest that a proper relationship would be advocacy is necessary, advocacy is good, but that advocacy should also be informed on the best available evidence and objective data. And our advocacy in our field, were we to be a fully mature profession, would be exactly that. It would be advocacy, by the way, not only for evidence-based practices, but for the research that we need to inform the field and to guide the field and to help us become better and better at teaching students with disabilities. So it's advocacy based on evidence and objective data and constrained by ethics. These things can all work together. And in this graphic, it just emphasizes that all of these things have an important role in the pursuit of justice for students with disabilities, which I would say is high quality and equitable special education for students with disabilities. And they definitely overlap and inform each other, but they're not one and the same. They all have unique roles and unique relationships to one another. And I'm saying all this, and maybe a lot of you are saying, yeah, or maybe you're disagreeing with me. I'll accept that as well. But a lot of people are like, well, is this really an issue? And I would argue that in special education, it is. I think that there has been some blurring of these roles and some efforts to deliberately blur these relationships and roles. And I want to take the position of saying, this is a crossroads, and I do think that we need to make a decision to clarifying and committing to these complementary roles. So let me explain what I mean. So there have been a lot of questions in scholarship about, science and values and what the roles are of each. So values and ethics are all about seeking justice, and science, even though this gets, tricky, seeking truth, right? And so values do play a role in science for sure. There's no question. And by the way, values can influence truth to some degree. However, where values really plays an important role in the practice of science is in the context of discovery. So when in research we're devoting money, or we're posing questions, or we're deciding what's an important thing to address to test, to teach, or to learn about, that's where values really play an obvious role and an okay role. So this is where, if we're deciding to conduct studies, if we're deciding to fund studies, what are the social concerns? What are the problems we should be looking at? An example in education would be choosing that, we need to conduct research to better understand how to effectively teach reading to students or students with disabilities. That's a value judgment, right? To say, well, reading's important. And right now, students with disabilities are not always achieving what we would hope in terms of reading outcomes. So this is important. Let's pursue the value of justice by choosing reading research. There's a different context where values are playing a much different role. And that is in the context of justification. So if I make a claim that says this reading curriculum or this reading practice works, well, that claim has to be supported through systematic evidence and transparent methods. So hypotheses or claims are tested through data, replication, and peer review. And this distinction between values in the context of discovery and objective data in the context of justification is what allows us to acknowledge values in choosing problems while maintaining objectivity and evaluating evidence. This may not seem controversial, but there are vocal, loud voices in the field who are starting to say, nope, you're wrong. We need to think about this differently. So what is that different way of thinking about it? So there is a strand, and it's been around for a long time, but it's still something that as a field we have to think about what do we want to do with this. But there are some schools of thought in special education that rightly acknowledge that science isn't perfectly value-free, and then they say, look, science is just politics. It's like any other ideology. And so let's stop pretending like science is about objectivity. Let's stop pretending that it's about, finding the truth about the effectiveness of practices or those kinds of things. So there are some voices in special education that really want to blend and blur ideology, blend and blur values in science, to take that diagram that I showed earlier and just squish everything together. And I think that the challenge that's happening is trying to understand what it means to have a commitment to social justice, which I would argue that we all have, even from my perspective, and what it is to have a commitment to truth seeking, right? To not just embrace things because they align with our intuitions or our politics or anything like that. And I think that the tension, the crossroads here is between, what should inform practice and progress in special education. So a lot of the folks who think that science is just politics want to say, look, all we need are personal narratives. Personal narratives are just as good as any kind of experimental or quasi-experimental or some other kind of rigorous test. And I think that we're at this moment, and I think that across all of us, all of our stakeholders, we need to think, is this a good thing? Should we just acknowledge that science is politics and stop pretending like we're testing claims that there's, objective data? If you recall back to what Carnine said about a mature profession, there's an expectation that there's an objective knowledge base that guides and informs practice. If we embrace this, then we at least would meet the definition of what Carnine said would be considered a mature profession. So some of the blurring, and not all, I don't mean to lump disability studies and education. I think that there's interesting scholarship that happens across all these different strands of scholarship. But under the umbrella of disabilities and studies in education, we've seen a lot of what I'm talking about. A lot of people arguing, look, let's stop pretending like science is value-free. Let's start saying that personal narratives, which often happen in the context of qualitative research, are the same as, experimental tests of whether or not something works. A lot of these folks have incorrectly, and Demetrius and I have written about this, argued that people who defend the role of science the way that I'm describing it embrace the medical model, that all we're concerned about is remediating deficits and normalizing kids. And that, I would argue, and Demetrius and I have argued, sorry, Demetrius, I keep bringing you into this, is a sort of a straw man argument against those who advocate for an important and at least somewhat distinct role for science. I do not personally embrace the medical model, those kinds of things. Also, there's an argument that special education and especially special education informed by science is all about pathologizing disability. There is a function in special education that requires you to identify students who, one, have disabilities, and two, have disabilities that adversely affect their educational performance. But again, I think that this is a false dichotomy that has confused things rather than helped us think about ways to move forward. And I'll come back to also under disability studies and education, there's a lot of people who advocate for full inclusion. One of the things that I know I've been asked to talk about, in ending what they call segregated special education, that is any kind of specialized classroom placement, school, those kinds of things. And the other thing that I would point out here that I think is really confusing about this debate, and it's a big one, I'm really boiling it down, but I will welcome questions later if you have them, is that, when people sort of are critical of evidence-based practice and they say, oh, all you want to do is correct deficits. Well, that's not true. I also advocate for effective accommodations to improve participation and belonging, and it's not an either or for me at all. But correcting deficits to me is, in a way, it's not a nice way to say it, but that's what we do when we teach, right? I mean, if a student doesn't know something and we help them know something or be able to do something, there is a way in which we can say that that's what teaching is. So if we're going to object completely to correcting deficits, then might we inadvertently say, boy, we shouldn't teach anything to students with disabilities. But we are working on a paper that is not done yet, where we sort of take some of these arguments and suggest that there are problems and there are dangers with embracing this idea that science is just politics. That paper's not out, but if you read academic papers, hopefully some of you do, hopefully you'll see that one soon. But there are a number of sort of intellectual movements that are under the umbrella, I would say, of disability studies and education, and those include the relatively new critical special education, discrit, and quantcrit. And I know that I'm talking about politics, which you're not supposed to do in polite company. Again, I welcome if you all have questions by the end about some of the things that I'm saying. So here's an example of where this blurring versus clarifying science, ethics, and advocacy really comes to bear in the United States. And this is something that I've written about, Demetrius has written about. There's a concern, and it's good to be concerned. So when we talk about values, I like that we have bothered to look at this particular issue, because minority students in the United States have been identified for a long time, since the law was founded, at percentages that are higher than their representation in the overall population. And this raises concerns about racism, right? And I think I'm glad that people are saying, hold on a second. Why are some kids from certain groups being identified at higher percentages than, that's what disproportionate identification means. So yes, we need to look at that, and we need to find rigorous ways to examine it. It was examined in particular ways for a long time, and then along came a group of researchers. Paul Morgan has led a lot of those, where he took a different approach, and he really looked at special education identification when you control the characteristics of students at the individual levels. So their academic achievement, their behavior problems, these kinds of things. And his evidence, and it continues to accumulate, is that minority students in the United States may be under-identified and underserved in special education, which is a very different conclusion from research prior to that. So all I want to say here, without getting too far into the weeds, is, doesn't that matter? Isn't it important for us to know whether or not the major problem is there are lots of students, minority students, being identified when they don't have disabilities, or if there are a lot of students who are not getting services that they're legally entitled to? Both of these are sort of justice questions, right? So it's really important for us to think about what is the nature of this problem. And we need rigorous scientific testing of claims, because just saying I think that it's racism, or I think that it's kids being underserved, which is also a kind of racism, by the way, we need rigorous tests to examine those claims. And I would point out here that there's also literature on disparities in access to services in other areas. For example, minority folks in the United States are less likely to get all kinds of medical services. They're less likely to get mental health services. And those are less controversial, which I also think is important to think about, because it makes one wonder, is there something about special education that it's viewed as such a terrible thing that when we say, uh-oh, there are kids who may not be getting special ed services, people don't have that same reaction and say, oh, that's terrible. We really should make sure that kids who need it. So I'm taking a very complex issue as an example, but I think that this is a nice illustration of why, yes, we need values like racism is terrible and we should combat it. But we also need to have rigorous research that tells us what's happening with this problem. Is that kids are getting services when they shouldn't be, or is it that they're not getting services when they should be? So this is just an illustration of how this particular crossroads, ethics, science, and advocacy, can play out. And we need to really think about what is the right path forward. Do we need clarity, or do we need to just say, look, ethics and science are the same thing, let's just treat it that way? So crossroad number 2, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And yeah, it's an interesting thing, because even when I started my doctoral program, and I was at the University of Virginia, and Jim Coffin was one of my instructors there, I went to lunch with him and another doctoral student. He was already talking about, oh, the roof is caving in. Special education is, under threat. And it was funny to me, because I'm like, oh, Jim, I'm just getting started. That sounds terrible. Maybe I should pick another field. Not really. But I think it's another thing that is worth reflecting on, is that this foundational law for special education in the United States has been controversial almost since it first began, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. But I think that it's important to think about the law and policies, because we can debate all these different things, but laws and policies are where all these debates and all these crossroads meet reality. So right now, for those again who are wondering, IDEA is still the law of the land in the United States, even though there are people who are thinking about ways to maybe weaken it or even get rid of it. But I think that the law and our policies and the way that we provide special education represent our commitments. These are our commitments. This is what we are committing to in terms of pursuing the goal of ensuring that all students get free and appropriate public education or special education. IDEA is a law, and it's a legal framework for making judgments for providing equitable, high-quality special education. I want to underline that there, because like all laws, and I'll make the argument that IDEA is really well crafted in many ways, but it nonetheless requires professionals in schools with students and families making judgments and making decisions. And I think we would love for that to go away, right? We would love to just have a framework that just makes our decisions for us. But even a really good law requires people to make judgments about what special education should be for a particular student. And the judgments that are baked in are: who gets special education? What should special education be? How should it be delivered? And also, fundamentally, I think we're always called back to this question of why. All right. And when I get to the next crossroad, that's where I say, what is the main purpose of special education? What is our highest priority? What is our job number one? The thing that we're supposed to do first and foremost for students with disabilities and their families. So basic components of IDEA, these aren't all of them, but things that I want to just say at the outset for talking about, do we need IDEA? Should we embrace it? Should we abandon it? Here we are at this crossroads. So IDEA, as many may be familiar, so I apologize, but in order to receive special education according to the law, you first have to meet the criteria for a qualifying disability category. And in the United States, for IDEA, there are 13 disability categories. And there's this other thing that a lot of people sort of overlook, which is really important. But it's not just that you have a disability as a student, but that disability adversely affects your educational performance, such that you need special education in order to achieve a free and appropriate public education. Okay, so there are students with disabilities who do not qualify for special education. It is an educational law. It is about providing specially designed, individualized instruction to students with disabilities to address their unique needs, not all the needs of a particular category, but for that individual student. The law does require appropriate non-discriminatory evaluation. The thing I would emphasize there is to determine whether or not a student is eligible for special education. It's not just one test. You have to have multiple sources of information and a team making the determination together. And all of these things are meant to guard against biased or discriminatory evaluation. FAPE is free and appropriate public education. It is operationalized or defined as specially designed instruction, which is delivered through an individualized education plan. There's also a requirement of the law that we need to think about at this crossroad, which is the least restrictive environment. So that means that the law requires that students with disabilities be educated to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. So it is in the law that the presumptive placement for students with disabilities will be with non-disabled peers in general ed classrooms. However, there's also, if the IEP team determines that the IEP can't be implemented appropriately in general education, the law requires a continuum of alternative placements. And it's a continuum. It's not you're either in general education or you're in some separate placement. There's the resource room, self-contained. Also, special educators can consult with general educators, self-contained classrooms, special schools, all the way to residential placements, which are overnight, home instruction for students who need it, and also instruction in hospitals. Also really critical to remember in thinking about this crossroad is the law requires partnership with parents. Parents have a lot of rights within the special education process. People will also either overlook that or misrepresent that when they want to argue that, you know, kids are being forced into a special placement. Well, when special ed is done according to the law, parents are supposed to be informed and involved. And I do recognize that that doesn't always go perfectly, but there are protections within the law. Also, just so you know, for specially designed instruction, there is also language of the law that says that the IEP team must use, or the IEP must incorporate research-based practices to the extent practicable. So there is something in the law, aside from these other debates about evidence-based practices, there's something in the law that says, no, you have to use those if they're available. So IDEA, again, like I said, almost since it started in 1975, almost 50 years ago, has been criticized and I think misunderstood to a large extent. But within the field, there are people who don't like IDEA the way it is. A lot of them object primarily to the least restrictive environment requirement and also the continuum of alternative placement. So they'll use the term segregation, which is a loaded term, particularly in the United States. And so they would say, hey, we need to get rid of IDEA because, or at least we need to get rid of the continuum of alternative placements. We want all students, or very nearly all students, to be taught in general ed all the time. Also, I mentioned multi-tiered systems of support. This is something that has been advocated, and I bet Dr. Fuchs spoke quite a bit about it, as advocated as we don't need IDEA anymore. We've got this multi-tiered approach. We can make general ed effective. We can provide supplemental and intensive instruction. Therefore, IDEA is unnecessary. I would point out that Doug Fuchs does not agree with this perspective. He sees a really important role for special education. However, there are people who will say, look, we've got this beautiful new thing that makes IDEA unnecessary. Again, concerns about disproportionate identification. People within the field think that IDEA may be perpetuating racism. And I would argue that we've got our own share of pseudoscience and also anti-science that tends to be within special education, tends to be like me, left and liberal, but I think it's misguided. Again, I think it's always well-intended, but I think that embracing what they're actually saying is misguided. And then I've already mentioned the current political climate, the dismantling of the Department of Education, attacks on public education, advocating school choice, getting rid of federal control. IDEA is a federal law. So, hey, let's just turn this into flexible grants, give it to the states. And by the way, the reason why IDEA came to be was that states, as you can probably guess, were doing all kinds of different things. Some states were actually doing a pretty good job providing special education, but many were not. And so the insight at the time that IDEA was passed was we need federal protections. All students with disabilities deserve specially designed instruction, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. I'll say this because I'm not sure how much I return to least restrictive environment, but I think one of the most useful ways of thinking about free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environment was Mitch Yell, who's a legal scholar in special ed, and he would use the term least restrictive appropriate environment. So the two are related. Free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environment should be thought of together as being complementary. But as we'll talk about in a second, the law makes it clear that job number one, our main priority, is ensuring a free and appropriate public education. So we're at a crossroads, and we've probably been there almost a few years after the law was passed, which is odd. And I hope people think about that, say, well, it's kind of weird. What's going on? But some people might say, perhaps it's time to question IDEA. It's almost 50 years old, right? Old things are no good. I'm over 50 years old, so I hope I hope people don't think about that automatically. But some people have said, look, surely it can be updated, improved, or perhaps even eliminated. It has been reauthorized with changes. Once in 1990, the last time it was reauthorized in 2004. People will argue about what was good about those updates. But some people will say, look, why do we need special education? Why do we have to have this thing where it's just for students with disabilities? Can't everyone qualify? Okay, and this is the kind of thing that Jim Coffin would love to talk about. I won't go into great depth, but this is, again, the kind of thing that sounds appealing and common sense. But I think if you spend a little bit of time saying, well, what does that mean to provide special education to everyone? Does that mean that students with the most exceptional needs will get special education? So it becomes a little bit illogical. Is specially designed instruction, individualized education programs, is that too hard to do? And it is hard to do, by the way. We found that to be one of the ongoing challenges of special ed training, is teaching teachers to develop IEPs and to deliver it. So some people say, hey, it's not necessary. We can do other things. Again, the full inclusion movement has said, look, we don't have to make all these difficult decisions about placement. All students should be placed in general ed. And then there are people who say, let's just get rid of the categories and the labels altogether, right? So labels carry potential stigma. We can make mistakes. We can identify kids. Those are important things, by the way. I'm not being dismissive, but the question is, and this is Jim talking to me, is can we have special education for students with disabilities if we don't name disabilities, if we don't use words for disabilities, if we don't talk about them, if we don't risk the downsides, the errors and the stigma. And there are some people, and this has been around for a long time, we don't need a dedicated system for special education. Let's merge it with general education. And so the question becomes for people, and again, I know IDEA is the United States, but I think a lot of people have thought about IDEA for their own countries, and I hope that's also true for Greece. Okay, what can we do away with and still pursue high quality, equitable special education? And what should we do away with? What are the things that are broken or bad? Let's get rid of them. This is one of the crossroads that we're at. I don't know if you were able to translate this, but this is a book by Jim Kaufman, Dan Hallahan, Paige Pullen, and Jean Marie Badar. And it's Special Education, Why It Is and Why We Need It. I recommend it because it's very short, but it gets right to these questions. Why can't we have special education for everybody, right? Why can't everybody be placed in general education? It's been translated to a lot of different languages, so it's one that I think if you found that really intriguing and you want to think more about those particular questions, this is a great resource for that. So we're at a crossroads. What does ethics tell us as a guide? What are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish with special education? Does abandoning or reworking or significantly changing IDEA get us closer to that? Would it move us farther away? We need to think about our ethical goals. What are we trying to achieve in terms of beneficence and justice? What about science? What would science tell us in terms of objective data about whether or not idea is working the way it is, or whether or not, we have evidence that another thing would work just as well or better. In advocacy, as I've suggested, we need to think about making sure that these three things line up in our decisions at this crossroad. So the very last crossroad, and I know I've been talking for a long time, I hope everybody's okay. It's a little odd. Oh, as everybody probably knows, doing it on Zoom. I hope that everybody's hanging in there. But this question, what is our goal? I think that this is a crossroad, again, whether it's recognized as such, that is perpetually playing out in a lot of things that are debates and controversies in special education. And one of the questions is, do we have to prioritize our goals? Do we have to say, hey, look, do we want to prioritize specially designed instruction that meets individual needs? Or do we want to prioritize placement in general education? Or do we have to? I'm going to admit here that the window has always been partially covering my slides, so I can't even read the last one I said. But the question is, what is it? What does it look like, right, for us to make progress toward, or even to get there, right, with equitable, high-quality special education? So there is an answer to this question in idea, and there's no question in the language of the law that FAPE, free and appropriate public education, is the primary obligation of the law. This must be addressed and satisfied first. You must have a individualized education program that addresses the unique and specific needs of the individual student within an IEP that is addressed through specially designed instruction. This is what the law requires as it is now. Then placement in general education is presumptive, meaning that if you can you can implement the IEP appropriately in general education, then that is what the law expects, that you will do that. However, what this does is it allows the judgment of the team to say, for this student, the IEP cannot be implemented appropriately. Therefore, somewhere else along this continuum would be appropriate. And thinking of that continuum, remember, students can be taught some of the time in general education, some of the time in a resource room, or some of the time in a special classroom, or they can be taught all the time in a special school. The law allows for, and in fact currently requires, the IEP team to make that judgment and to determine what is the most appropriate environment. So this is a place where the term least restrictive appropriate environment would be appropriate. So appropriate is a term in the law, it feels kind of vague, but basically it means that it's individualized, that it addresses the unique needs of that individual student, that it is designed to ensure meaningful progress for the student, and that it is delivered in what is the least restrictive environment for that individual student. The law does not require inclusion in general education. It requires an individual determination along that continuum of alternative placements. I know that Gary Hornby has written about inclusive special education, which I think is a terrific model. And I would just point out right now, and I think Gary would agree with me, is that the way inclusion is designed now, it is, and probably should be referred to as inclusive special education, where inclusion carries weight. There is a presumptive placement in general education. It's important, but it's not absolute. Special education expertise is essential. A continuum of, Gary calls it support, but a continuum of placements or ways that services can be delivered is necessary, and that those individual needs should drive placement. So I think that when people have wondered about IDEA, and I think it gets characterized in all kinds of different ways in the literature, I would argue it's designed very much the way that Dr. Hornby would talk about inclusive special education, and that's worth noticing. So a question then is free and appropriate public education, or IEPs and specially designed instruction, does it line up with the law in advocacy? Is this what most people who are out there talking about, we need to make special education better, is this what they're talking about? We need more specially designed instruction. We need to make sure that all students receive a free and appropriate public education. To an extent, yes, I don't want to dismiss all the advocacy, but I would say that it's a fairly reasonable thing to say most of the advocacy in special education has focused on the place of instruction. And I think one of the most vocal advocacy movements in special education in the United States and certainly internationally has been the full inclusion movement, where The emphasis is on we need to stop teaching students in places other than general education. I think that the full inclusion movement is quite good at using powerful emotional appeals. Opposition to the term has been segregation, and that's certainly an emotional term. When I've written about it in my scholarship, I've suggested that it's a term that is misleading, and it's meant to it appeals to people on a surface level, but it really ignores the deep thinking about place and instruction that's necessary. But I think that for the people in the full inclusion movement who have made place of instruction first and foremost the priority, there's an assumption that there is no trade-off between delivering FAPE, providing students FAPE, and inclusion in general ed. The assumption is that fair and just instruction can and will be provided in general education environments in every or nearly every case. And I think if we stand at this crossroads, we need to think about, is that true? Is that true? Are we at that point? If not, then maybe we need to think more carefully about what we're advocating for. So here's a long thing that I'm probably going to rely on you to read later. This is something that Demetrius and Jim and I wrote. But it is interesting to think for a moment about why would the law make a free and appropriate public education primary? Or you might say, well, of course it would, right? But for a minute, let's say, why did the law say, look, you must ensure a free and appropriate public education, and then place is secondary. Place needs to facilitate FAPE, okay? And it's a reminder of why education is a moral obligation at all, right? What do kids get? What do our students get? Any of our students when they get effective instruction? And this is a long way of saying, I'm not going to read it because I'm blocking my own view, of saying that providing students with an effective, free, and appropriate public education can be the difference between more and less independence, more and less choices across the lifespan, more or less inclusion within the community after school. So this is the way that, when we wrote about, why is FAPE primary? What is the sort of moral argument for why we need to protect this first and foremost, to make sure that every student with disability receives effective specially designed instruction. And this is sort of what we arrived at. And in a concrete way, we can think about it sort of in reverse. Should we object from an ethical perspective or a moral perspective to students being in general education classrooms and not receiving effective instruction? And I think that when we think about it that way, we might say, yeah, if a student is not receiving the best possible instruction that allows them to learn the most things that they need to know, then that's not ethical. That's not justice, right? So I think that we kind of laid out, and I think it's important because one of the reasons why I think FAPE is not central in advocacy is it's kind of an abstraction, right? Place is very concrete. How many students with disabilities are in general ed classrooms? That's very concrete, right? We can look and we say, oh no, too many are not. How many kids are receiving FAPE? That's a harder thing to measure, a harder thing to advocate for. But I would argue, and I hope my perspective in this crossroad has been clear, that we need to do that. We need to make this central to what we advocate for, to our policymakers, to our teacher training programs, everything else, ensuring that we do all the things we need to do to make sure that students with disabilities receive FAPE, specially designed instruction through an individualized education program. And so for those people who say, hey, we can have both, why can't we have inclusion and FAPE? Why do they say that? Hold on, I want to make sure all right, I'm jumping around, sorry, I'm probably making you dizzy. So here's what I want to say. If we agree, and I'm not going to assume there'll be a lot of people who disagree with me and think I'm talking nonsense, and you can yell at me at the end, that's okay. But if we were to say, yeah, let's prioritize FAPE again, let's go back to our roots and idea and say what we should be out there championing, let's get more research, let's do everything we can to make FAPE better. The progress means that we're getting better at ensuring FAPE for more and more students with disabilities. So what would that require? That's what I want to talk about next. Within this crossroads, I'm going to assume, let's pick that direction. What does it mean we need to do? What choices would we need to make next? So the crossroads within this FAPE crossroad, I think, are first we need to deal with full inclusion versus the continuum. Then I think we need to acknowledge what's happening with optimizing our professional knowledge base. What is the research-based knowledge that is guiding our profession as it relates to ensuring FAPE? Then how do we translate that knowledge base? And then how do we need to think about sustaining special education over time? So again, the assumption and idea is that FAPE cannot always be achieved satisfactorily in general environments. So that requires a continuum of alternative placements. And what that means is place is a decision that is secondary to instruction. If anything needs to bend, place has to bend to instruction. So why do people object to alternative placements? Well, this is something that, same thing that we wrote about. And if you want to look for more details, I don't think, and Demetrius can correct me, I don't think this book is in print yet, but this is where we talk about, here are the arguments that are made for why the continuum of alternative placements are unnecessary and immoral. Separate placements constitute ableist segregation. Again, there's that word segregation. The argument is that the whole point of the placements is to force students with disabilities to earn inclusion. That's not, if you understand what the law is saying, that's not at all what the purpose of alternative placements is. Same thing that I talked about before, alternative placements is all grounded in a deficit mindset. I think that's a straw man. Some people have said, look, special ed is a service, not a place. You can do it anywhere. And I'll talk about that in a second. Then there's research, the argument that research shows that students who are taught in general ed, students with disabilities achieve better outcomes. Not so much. When you actually look at that research, that's not true. And then the argument is, we've got a whole bunch of practices that we now know how to make general ed effective for all students with disabilities. That is not what the research says. So why do we have to think about, if special ed is a service, not a place, can't we just do it anywhere? And I think that we can just go to logic here first. We could go to the research and understand that it doesn't show that general ed works better for all students with disabilities. But what are the dimensions of location that relate to the kinds of instruction we can deliver? There are physical dimensions, social dimensions, practical dimensions, professional and programmatic dimensions that actually either allow or constrain different types of instruction. And so when we think about, if we are going to make FAPE, free and appropriate public education, primary, we have to acknowledge that there are these limitations, that there are things about one location or the other that are going to better support FAPE and some that are not going to support as well. And by the way, for these reasons, and I didn't go into the details about the arguments for full inclusion, but these are reasons why we do need a continuum of alternative placements, and we do need to make inclusion presumptive, but because FAPE is primary, we need to say if a special placement is needed part or all of the time, that option needs to be available for providing FAPE. So I think Brian Cook really took care of this, and maybe Jim as well, but we need to think about what is our knowledge base, what is the set of evidence-based practices that we know are most likely, again, it's about probability, most likely to achieve positive and the best possible outcomes for students with disabilities. So we need to make sure that we have evidence-based practices and we continue to develop evidence-based practices. Within research on special education, there have been some problems with how research is conducted. Brian Cook, again, is at the center of that for how do we improve the research so that we can identify even better or in more useful ways for teachers what effective practices are. We also, and this is a place where I think we're falling down because we haven't made FAPE central, we haven't made evidence-based practices central, is to make sure that we ensure scientific rigor in how we communicate in our field. And I'm pointing to some of my colleagues, and I've probably been guilty of some miscommunication in the past, so I'm not judging anybody, but we need to be really clear about what we mean when we say something is evidence-based. There are practices, and hopefully this won't rankle too many feathers. That might be hard to translate, I apologize. Hopefully this won't make too many people mad, but the research is actually not very strong for supporting co-teaching, for supporting universal design for learning, multi-tiered systems of support, and it does not support the way that some people say it does, full inclusion. And so what's happening is people are communicating about practices in ways that aren't rigorous. It does not mean, I'll take multi-tiered systems as an example, that it couldn't be developed to a point where it does all the things that we hope it does. But we need to be honest, clear, and we need to speak truth about where things are in terms of what we know. These are all things that people say, here's how we make general ed work for all students. If that's not based on truth, if it's not based on rigorous research, then we're going to pursue things that are not going to benefit and could potentially harm some kids with disabilities. And I also think our knowledge base has to consider our understanding of disability. I mentioned earlier, there's this debate going on between medical model and social model of disability. I don't mean to give that short shrift, but I would just say it's important that special ed embrace a model of disability that is multidimensional, that it isn't that disability is just social, that it's just medical, that it includes cultural aspects, social aspects, psychological, biological. I think that it's really important for us as a field to embrace interactional models of disabilities. Demetrius has written some really helpful things about this, but I think it's part of our knowledge base. How are we training people to think about disability? How do we understand disability? And because we're about education, how do we understand the implications of disability for teaching and learning? That's going to be central. I'm getting close, hang in there. And then another important crossroad, okay, we're embracing FAPE, we're embracing evidence-based practices and the research needed. How do we translate this research out there into practice? And again, 12 years I was in classrooms. I know about this. It's great to hear people like me who are in universities now saying, hey, evidence-based practice. There's a lot of work I think that we need to do. And this is where I think I'm working with Demetrius, but we're thinking about, well, what would it take if we really embrace FAPE as our goal number one, as the thing that we need to pursue? How do we translate this knowledge? And that includes looking at the research to teacher training gap, research to working conditions gap. It doesn't matter how effective practices are or how well we train teachers if we put them in conditions where they can't do what they've been trained to do. And the last thing would be sustaining special education. I'm going to double check with Demetrius and make sure, are you on because I need to wrap it up? I've lost track of time. Okay. So I won't say a whole bunch of things here, but I would say that look for, again, if you're a special ed teacher, I'm extremely mindful of how incredibly busy you are. Everybody here is busy, but we're writing some new papers that are going to be about how do we improve teacher education to improve that translation of the knowledge base to teachers. And the last thing that I would say to let you all off the hook is we do absolutely need to think about the working conditions. And this is something that Jim said to me once, and I think it's really important, that what we do or what we fail to do that makes special education harder for special educators hurts students with disabilities. I think that when we think about moving special education forward, we really need to focus on moving it forward for special educators. All right. Thank you for the cue, Demetrius. I haven't presented this before, so my apologies that I went a little bit long, but hopefully I've given you some things to think about, and I welcome your questions.
Andrew, thank you very much for that insightful presentation on the issues and the controversies surrounding special education, inclusion, and the current landscape of the field. It was not boring, I would say. In fact, it managed to generate 16 questions for discussion,
Oh,
16
wow.
questions. So I don't know if we have time to address all of them. And I hope you are ready to answer all of them.
I can try. I can try.
Okay, so we have 60 questions, mostly from elementary teachers. And perhaps additional questions may arise as you respond to this initial, again, 16 questions. I will proceed now with the questions translated by me into English, starting with questions that have more relevance to the topic of the presentation. What are the conditions? The first question is, what are the conditions that would transform a school into a school for all. Just a clarification, school for all is typically used as a slogan in the Greek context, but maybe is a little bit ambiguous. Maybe is another term for full inclusion. It's not used always like this, but this is the question, to transform a school into a school for all. And the second part of the question is, in the American context, do these conditions exist?
That's a great question. And I think my short answer would be no, there are no schools that are able to serve all students with disabilities. I think for some of the reasons that I talked about near the end, we still do need the continuum of alternative placements, because there are some students who, in my background, I worked in a couple of special schools for students with disabilities. They may still need that level of placement in order to fully address and fully implement their individualized education program. I think that, and this may be some of what's happening with multi-tiered systems of support. I think that Dr. Fuchs spoke about that. That's one of the goals, right? Is to try to develop, first core instruction for all students that meets almost all students with disabilities needs. But then they need there will still be students who need something special in multi-tiered systems of support. They may need tier 2 supplemental instruction, and then there will still be some students who need intensive instruction. So there's a parallel between multi-tiered systems of support and the continuum of alternative placements. But I would say that at this moment, and I'm not going to say that it could never happen, but I think it's important, if our goal is to better pursue inclusion, the way that I'm talking about inclusion that also meets the needs of all kids, we have to be honest about where we're at. And that is, we do not know how to make those schools inclusive for all kids. There is no guide from evidence that would tell us, here's what you do, and now you're going to have a school that can meet the needs of every student. And I'm thinking here about every student with disabilities.
The second question is about the existence of special schools. The question goes like this: is the existence of special schools considered an obstacle or a prerequisite for the implementation of the principles of inclusion in the education of students with special educational needs? Special educational needs in Europe and in Greece is used as another term for students with disabilities.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that this has been one of the arguments for a long time, is that it's the existence of special placements, including special schools, that keep us from achieving full inclusion, right? If we just abandon all these other options, then we'd be forced to sort of figure it out. I don't think that this is what the question asker is asking, but I'm very wary of that, because it's almost like we're using students as a lever for policy change, right? And if we say, let's take away all the options for students, because then we get rid of this barrier, right? The fact that there are options means we don't embrace full inclusion. I think that would be unethical. Now, I come from special schools, and so and I actually was involved in a high-profile federal case before Trump's second term, where this was at issue, and people were saying, look, why can't you just teach all these students in the general school, but in special classrooms? And we had to talk about that there are some students who they need special programming across all the environments in the hallway. And I've worked with students with really significant emotional and behavioral problems where we really had to program the entire building, from the cafeteria to all these different things. So I would say that having special placements is not what's stopping us from achieving more inclusion. And I am in favor of achieving more inclusion. What's stopping us is we need to focus on effective practices, and at the same time think about which of these effective practices could be delivered across a variety of environments. I think that by embracing evidence-based practices and making that first and foremost, and Dimitris and I and Jim wrote about this, that it gives us a way to pursue what we called robust inclusion, where students are getting the instruction that they need, but also taught more and more with students who don't have disabilities. And that's been the progress, by the way, in the United States. When you look at the data, more and more students with disabilities have been placed in general education. What's less well known is, are those students receiving the best possible IEPs that they could be receiving, or the best possible instruction? So I hope that helps.
Yep, it
Okay.
helps a lot. There is a question about, actually there are 3 questions about co-teaching. The name of co-teaching in Greece is parallel support model, which has some differences, organizational differences with the how in the US we implement co-teaching. But anyway, the question is that should the parallel support model, should co-teaching be implemented in Greece in order for the Greek school system to become more inclusive? This is a general question.
Sure.
There are other questions relevant to this.
Okay.
One is about the realities.
Mhm.
The government's recent decision involve funding cuts and reductions to co-teaching, parallel support, for students with special education needs, and the weakening at the same time of the resource rooms under the banner of inclusion, in the name of inclusion.
Right.
Using the argument, it's a comment as well. There is a comment here. Using the argument of stigmatization, they're asking special education teachers to support students with difficulties exclusively within the general education classroom. How do you comment on this?
Okay.
And there is another about parallel support and co-teaching. In the current context, does it also require the co-presence of teachers in the classroom, the availability of all necessary professional roles within the school, and adequate infrastructure, buildings, equipment, and resources to support the achievement of the goals of individualized education programs for all students? There is 3 questions about co-teaching, parallel support, and one about the realities, the current realities about restrictions and cuts, funding cuts, and resource rooms as well.
Right. I want to be really clear, because I think the way that I framed my discussion at Crossroads, I think that students with disabilities, many of them, and most of them, should be taught in general ed classrooms. When I pointed out, for example, that the research on co-teaching isn't really clear, that just means that we need to be honest about that, and we need to figure out how to make it work better. I think there are really good models, by the way, for providing what I've called specially designed instruction in a co-teaching arrangement. So I'm not arguing that those things should never be done. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that we need a lot of clarity about what that is and how that can be done. I can't get into probably the details of that, but I could certainly share maybe through Dimitris what I think are some really good models for how do we think about specially designed instruction. I think there needs to be role clarity. I think that there needs to be clear understanding between parallel support teachers about their roles and their authority, and the importance of all the students in a classroom. The whole thing about reducing resources and funding is maddening, and it's something that happens in education policy all the time, where they think that the way that they're going to make things better is by removing support, removing money, removing these resources. I just want to say it's nonsense, right? So it's not going to improve things. It almost inevitably creates problems that become more difficult to solve by, it's like short-sighted, right? That would be the term. So I think that's ridiculous. As far as the stigma of being pulled out to a resource room, that option needs to be available, and we have to think about stigma. I'm not saying that we just go, oh, if the student feels bad about themselves, then too bad. However, there is actually a good amount of research that shows it can be very stigmatizing to be a student with a disability. Let's say if you can't read and you're in the general ed classroom in front of all your peers. So we need to think about stigma in a much more complex way, right? And there are times, especially when special education is really good, that students with disabilities feel better about themselves when a competent special educator pulls them out, gives them instruction that allows them to learn something that they weren't learning in the larger group. My guess is that a lot of the folks in on this presentation, these are kind of common sense things, but I do think that common sense is what we need right now. Common sense informed by research, right? So we do need to bother to say, is that research based? But at the same time, things like reducing support for teachers is going to make things worse for students. That was sort of my last slide that I realized I had talked too long, but it's an important lesson to learn.
There is a question about the future of special education in Greece, but I guess it's about the future of special education worldwide, internationally, in the United States and internationally. The question is, unfortunately, ethics and professional responsibility do not seem to be adequately safeguarded, guaranteed within the current concept of inclusion, which is being designed without the necessary prerequisites, basic prerequisites. In implementing inclusive models and in collaborative meetings between general and special education schools, there are still significant difficulties in teacher cooperation regarding shared goals and differentiated instruction. So there is a question about the future and also a comment that goes with this question.
Yeah. The future of education, and I understand exactly, what you're saying. And I think one of the hardest things for trying to be a scholar in special education, like Demetrius and I do, and trying to keep things like ethics and science and advocacy working together properly, is that teachers have problems today. So Demetrius and I spend a long time writing a paper. We hope that a paper is helpful in guiding thinking, but we also recognize that the journey to a better place is a long one. There is nothing that, and you all probably know this because you've probably been to talks by scholars, and there's nothing we're going to say that's going to fix things overnight. But I do think that what we can do, from teachers to policymakers to advocates to researchers, is deliberately try to focus on good ways of thinking about what we're doing. So if we're thinking about inclusive education, that's a great example. And I know that that's the term, right? And I think Gary uses it he's from England, I think that's okay to say inclusive education or inclusive special education, but still the question that should be first is the one that I suggested should be first. What is the model we should use for determining the individualized education needs of each student with a disability? And then what practices should we use to deliver them? Then where it happens. So the what, to this is where I think we're lost. It's the what first, and it's the where second. And I get that there's all kinds of reasons why, especially if you're a teacher, you don't get to make these big decisions about which model we're embracing. I'm not naive to that. But as a field, we need to be changing our thinking to, how do you teach a student with these particular needs? What are the most effective practices? And then have that drive decisions about how it's implemented. That includes where is the best place to deliver this instruction and who is the best person to deliver it. And even though we're sort of forced away from that conversation, I think it's a good idea for the field to say, let's get back to our roots. And they're my roots in the sense that this is IDEA. And I want to emphasize too, that even though IDEA says free and appropriate public education and the IEP comes first, placement comes second, there are many people who I respect in my field who don't even talk that way. So I just want to emphasize, it's been hard to force the field even here, where the law is not ambiguous about this, to think that way, to say, let's figure out what the student needs first, instead of saying, how do we pursue inclusive education for all these kids? Suddenly it's not individual anymore, right? Suddenly it's, hey, we need to do inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. It's the same here, by the way, folks. Even though our law says
sorry, Andrew, sorry for interrupting you. Just to clarify that about the acronym IEP is Individualized Educational Program. In some countries can be planned. In Greece, it still exists. So
okay,
this is what you speak about. About the.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I didn't talk about, and I ran out of time, and bless all of you for hanging in there with me, is when I think about one of the biggest things that needs to be fixed in this sort of complicated problem, it's me and Dimitris. It's teacher education, and it's the people who try to advocate at our level. We need to get our act together and really think about, how are we disseminating knowledge? How are we training teachers? I think that we're doing a lot of things that need to be improved. And but there's no, this is the problem with the complex problem. It's no one thing that's going to fix it all. By the way, on a more concrete level, I do think that there are ideas from, let's say, multi-tiered systems of support and positive behavior support, which I'm not sure if that's a term or not in Greece, that can help schools, right? If you're trying to improve, but I just wouldn't want schools to think that there's some secret framework out there that works all the time for all schools and all kids. That just doesn't exist. We still are in a place where we have to think, when we think about exceptional learners, students with disabilities or special needs, we have to think about them on an individual level and make judgments about them on an individual level. And I do understand the pressure on teachers to go a different direction. You have to do your best with where things are now. I want to be really clear that I'm not saying at all, and maybe it didn't come across this way, that students with disabilities can't be taught effectively in general ed. They can. But even then, the job is, what do these kids need and how do we deliver it in whatever setting that they're in?
You mentioned in your answer about the teacher preparation. So there is, I'll go with this question about teachers' preparation for addressing the needs of students with disabilities. The question is the following. What do you believe is the most effective way for teachers to specialize in special education? Should this specialization be primarily provided through universities and their academic programs, or through other forms of professional training? And there is explanation, because this is the reality in Greece, even if this training is provided also by universities, but the explanation in a parenthesis is that short-term or accelerated programs offered by organizations, whatever.
Yeah. I think that we need to improve university training. I think we need to improve professional preparation. That's the traditional model, where you earn a degree and a credential or whatever. I think we need
Traditional
to,
in a good sense, because traditional in a good sense, because
traditional
sometimes
in a good sense. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of evidence that traditional preparation has significant advantages, that thorough training and those kinds of things. I also think that, and I don't think you meant this, you meant what we would call like alternative preparation, like short-term, fast track. But I'll also say that in addition to university training, which I think can be improved, I think university training is an immature profession, the way I talked about in the presentation. I also think that there are things that can be done to train teachers in the schools that can be done much better. Our friend Paige Pullen does stuff on teaching reading, where she works with people in schools. So we need to do both of those. The alternative licensure thing, I think everybody probably knows the answer to that. It can be done fairly well. It can be done very poorly. There are disadvantages to fast track training. Our biggest problem, and I'm guessing it's a similar problem in Greece, is turnover, right? So you put special ed teachers into schools and they only last a year or two. If you don't, you need two things, right? You need people who are trained enough to do the job, and not have to learn on their feet. But then you also have to have administrators and principals who understand the working conditions required for special educators to do their job. This is all against, again, Demetrius and I are in universities, probably other people listening are in universities. We're very aware of all the real right now challenges. The reason why we have alternative licensure is because of high turnover, and they need to hire special educators. Here in the United States, there's a shortage all the time. However, I think this is sort of my point. We need these short-term solutions, but I think we as a field need to invest in more durable thinking about who we are and what we do and how do we get better, right? So the original idea is, how do we revitalize, strengthen special education? I think IDEA is a great framework for the delivery of special education. I think evidence-based practices should remain central. And I think that evidence-based practices should become much more infused within teacher preparation and also supporting teachers in schools.
Just a clarification that if shortage of special education teachers is a reality in the United States, there is a redundancy of special education teachers. There are more teachers than the current positions.
Oh, wow.
So there is an abundance of
Okay.
This is
You all are lucky. You got a lot of people who want to help. That's excellent.
Let's proceed with the next question.
Sure.
About state social policy. The question is, does inclusion require a state social policy that promotes equality and the rights of all citizens? Does it also require a certain level of social maturity? Does it require a legislative framework and social structures that protect and strengthen the rights of everyone?
I think the short answer for me is yes. And by state, I would understand that to be laws and policies, government laws and policies that protect the rights of students with disabilities and their families. And when you say inclusion, this is the thing that I think is often misunderstood about federal law in the United States, is it does require inclusion unless the student's IEP, individualized education program, can't be met. I think that we have a long history of knowing what it's like when these protections aren't in place. And it's not a good history, right? There are many terrible things that have happened to people with disabilities without these rights, without these protections, and without making them strong. I'm making a little bit of a distinction, and maybe this is me in particular in the United States. Again, I'm thinking about, do we need a system of laws and rights and regulations to ensure special education? And I would say yes. And then should that special education include an emphasis on inclusion when appropriate? And I would say yes. So it's kind of a boring conclusion. There are a lot of people who want to redo everything, but I really think that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is a remarkable piece. It's not perfect. No law is. Again, people have to make judgments. But I think that it provides a framework and sort of the guardrails for a really good way of providing special education. And it includes inclusion. Yeah.
The following question is about the debates on inclusive education. It's a kind of challenge question. It goes like, given the international debates on inclusive education, what is the greatest theoretical or ethical dilemma that special education faces today as a scientific field, if we consider this as a mature scientific field, as you said? Do you believe that schools in the near future will rely more or individualized learning for all students? I underline all students because I think this is the meaning of the question here.
Yes, yes.
Individualized learning for all, so that the concepts of special education needs becomes less important
That's great. And I think I lost track of the first one. Sorry about that. I'll try to come back for it. That this idea, and probably this audience is aware of things like personalized learning. I think that there's a lot of excitement over new technologies and artificial intelligence and those kinds of things. And I think those things are, again, special education. Science is open-mindedness first. It's, what are all these possibilities? And then it's skepticism, right? Okay, well, let's test these things. So I think personalized learning and individualized learning, these are all great ideas. It's going to be a matter of what do they actually mean and what kind of outcomes do they actually produce. But let me say this about the concept of special needs. And one of the things that I think is most challenging to think about when we think about making education better for everybody. When you think about making education better for everybody, you have to consider the likelihood or almost the certainty that if every student that we currently teach received their best possible individualized education, they're not all going to end up the same at the end of that process. In fact, there's some evidence from like public health and other places that when you do this, and it's a good thing to do, by the way, I'm not arguing against it, but it doesn't make these differences that we call special needs disappear. In fact, in some cases, there may be a paradoxical effect where they become even more pronounced, right? Where you're still going to have these differences. So I think that what you start to grapple with that idea, and I think I don't discount it. I don't say, oh no, because I'm skeptical about whether or not we can actually provide special ed to every student right now. But what you have to think about is what is the nature of the diversity that we call disability? And I think happily, I think we're always going to have to think about how do we embrace all people, including people with disabilities, as part of our society? What do we owe all people, including students with disabilities, whether or not they have special needs or they go away, right? If they continue to have special needs. And I think, and I'm not sure what the other question was, Demetrius, but for whatever reason, it made me think about, I put up a slide and I didn't read it, that, what is the point of education? Like, when do we know that it's working? We do have to look at long-term outcomes for students who receive special education. We do need to think about, are they better off for having had special education than for not having it? It is a mistake, however, and this is Jim and Demetrius hears them too. It's a mistake to think that we should expect those outcomes to be identical, meaning that if students who get special education don't end up in the exact same place as students without disabilities, does that mean special education failed? No, that's the wrong comparison. But we do want to look at special education and look at ways in which it, in the long term, improves the lives of the students who receive it. I don't know why I answered that way. I was trying to keep both your questions in my head. And if you need to repeat the first one, you can do that, but I hope that's helpful.
There was a first part of the question, but I think you answered the second part. You focused on the second part. The first part was about the international debates on inclusive education and the greatest theoretical dilemmas and ethical dilemmas that they do exist in special education today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it really does boil down to how are we going to respond to the diversity that we call disability? How are we going to respond to that in schools? And then how are we going to respond to that in society as well? I think, and there are many things about the United States that I'm not currently proud of, but also in general, where I think we really fail in terms of providing the kinds of basic help that people need. And one thing that doesn't often get talked about in special education is what happens after students graduate from school. And I would argue that we've got some, not perfect, but pretty strong protections for students when they're in school. But I don't know that we really have what we need to have in place when students graduate as well. So I think that in school and after school and across society, we really need to think, and I think it's an ethical and a theoretical dilemma. And the dilemma may be in education. how do we respond to disability? Is it that we provide first and foremost instruction that's responsive to that diversity? Or do we first and foremost try to make sure that all students are in general education? Are we focused on instruction first, place second? Or are we focused on place first and instruction second? I don't know how many
Thank you.
people in academia would frame the dilemma that way, but I think that that way of framing it will be supportive of some really important thinking. Let me just say that.
You mentioned earlier in one of your answers artificial intelligence. So there is a question about it. Can the use of artificial intelligence ensure the educational rights of students with special educational needs?
It's a great question, and I have not engaged with that scholarship enough. I am starting to use. I'll confess, hopefully it doesn't get me in trouble with this.
Plead the fifth, the silence to
Plead the fifth.
the right to the right to silence.
I have gone to some training here at Kent State. I'm aware of the downsides and the dangers, so I'm not, going to champion it. But I know that in various professions, artificial intelligence is being used to support practice in a variety of ways. And I think it'd probably be a mistake to pretend like we shouldn't do that at all. So, when you think about things like making what I'll call clinical decisions or judgments about special education, it may be that tools are developed that are really helpful. I think that what that would do is similar to what we talked about with personalized learning or giving special ed to everybody, is it may improve practice, and then it's going to improve outcomes to a degree, but I think it's the same thing. I think that we should pursue better special education, not for the purpose of achieving the same outcome for every student all the time, but for achieving the best possible outcome for all those students, every student that we serve. And I do think that special education, I love my general education colleagues. I'm supportive of them, but I think that special education, and this is something that Jim would say too, we really need to focus on what we're doing first and foremost, and then become better at that. And then we can think about what we could do to also support general education in their efforts. I don't know why I steered into that, but artificial intelligence, I don't know the scholars who are doing that work within special education. Maybe Demetrius will take that on. I don't know. We'll see.
No, I cannot.
I think it's something we have to think about, right, Demetrius?
For the time being, I cannot. Okay, it's not
Right.
my expertise right now. Okay.
Yeah.
There is because you didn't cover some of the slides you had towards the end of your presentation. A good guy here may help you to cover this. There is often a gap between academic research and everyday classroom practice. How can research truly influence what happens in the classroom, rather than remaining only at the level of theory? This is the question.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical, right? And I think that partnering with schools is one way to ensure that there's, from the beginning, a focus on realities of the classroom and not just, rigorous research designs. I think that that can be very beneficial. I think that, there is a progression in research that's meant to go from what you would call more artificial kinds of circumstances, like a lot of help from researchers, a lot of resources, to testing interventions in realistic conditions. So we have to be extremely mindful of that. That comes up all the time in my scholarship. Is it sort of just underscores how complicated the problem is, and I love that the person asked this question. Making these changes in practice requires us to design interventions that are usable, that can be, and there's someone from the late 90s they used to cite all the time, where people on my side, right, hopefully that we're all on the same side, but here you're in a university, you're developing a practice that if you don't think about all of those things from the beginning, the tools, the training, the technology of implementation, you have to make it doable by the people you're asking to do it. And that needs to be baked into the entire research process. I'm afraid to bring this up, but I had a slide earlier and Demetrius saw it. And the big research arm in the United States is the Institute for Educational Sciences. And this is the Trump administration put out a new reimagining, and it terrifies us, right? I'm scared. And I'm not telling you I'm going to naively accept it. But there's some language in there that I would say, okay, politics aside, do we need to make it more practical? Do we need to focus more on priorities identified by the schools? I think that even though it's coming from suspicious political territory, I'll just say that, I think that we need reforms in how we conduct research so that they become more immediately usable by teachers. There should be more partnership, by the way, not just partnership with schools, but I think stakeholders should partner across all of our special ed folks to support that idea.
There are two philosophical questions. As special education stands at this critical crossroads, how can we ensure that its future will be oriented toward a more Aristotelian direction? And there is a clarification about this, where the educational process aims at the personal well-being, eudaimonia, I think is the Aristotelian term, and the holistic flourishing of every student. And there is also a comment, regardless of their measurable economic or productive output.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the emphasis on flourishing is great. I love that term and that more holistic approach. There are some things that are by design in idea that if there are social, emotional, behavioral concerns, things with adaptive living, so there's a way in which special education is kind of leaning that way already, right? So that's holistic focus. And you are required by law to consider all of these things that could impact education. I think that the other thing that we've got to be really thinking about is what can we realistically expect of special education, and what do we need to expect of related disciplines and society, right? So I think that this is a problem with education in general, is both, by the way, politically, both right and left, we get picked on and say, hey, education, you should solve all these problems. Our kids have this problem, you should solve. I think we've got to draw some lines around that and say, these are the things that we can do, but it's wrong to think that all of these problems of flourishing, all of these conditions that are necessary for flourishing must be addressed by education alone. I don't think that that's what this questioner is saying, but I do think that, it's an interesting thing because teaching is super hard. Teaching's super hard, any kind of teaching, right? And again, that's my respect, 12 years. I've done it myself. I know how hard it is. So we have a hard time addressing the things that we are officially on paper, like academic, reading, math, writing, all that stuff. I like the idea of becoming more holistic, but we have to really think about what we've been able to accomplish so far and where we need to do better before we keep adding more and more things to our plate. So that's not pushing back on the idea of flourishing, but we can't make promises we can't keep. That doesn't help anybody, right? So we need to make sure that we're focused on the things that we're charged with in terms of that. And then we need to advocate as citizens for other things around flourishing. Families.
So there is a logical follow-up in what you said. What is the meaning of inclusion? What is the meaning of inclusion? What are dilemmas and practices? This is the question. It's not by me, but
well, and I'm sure that this audience has seen the confusion that comes up internationally, because sometimes, and for many countries, inclusion first is just inclusion in education at all, right? So there are countries where students with disabilities don't receive any kind of education, and historically that was the case in the United States. Going back to those 50 years before IDEA, many kids were not included in the literal sense in our education system, period. Right? So the first part of inclusion is all kids have a right to a free and appropriate public education. Then I think the way that Demetrius and I don't mean to grab you and pull you into my world, Demetrius, but we've talked about instruction being multidimensional, and Jim Kaufman for sure, that it isn't just about being physically in a place, that it's being, having your educational and your other flourishing type needs met, feelings of belonging, feelings of being valued. I don't think it's ever been an either or, but I think my definition of inclusion would be you're in a place where your needs broadly defined are being appropriately addressed. And I know that in my special schools, a lot of times, this all devolves into, oh, those terrible places. But I was lucky enough to work in, actually, I'll say 3 special schools where they were amazing places. The kids were loved and supported and made progress appropriate to, their particular challenges. And I think it's just a mistake to think that place makes inclusion. You can have inclusion in the sense that people are valued, loved, they belong, they get their needs met in a lot of different places. That's my argument.
There is another question about, it's very, very short actually, as it is formulated, inclusion and law. I guess it is the relationship between inclusion and the law, I guess in the United States, or if you know internationally.
Yeah. Yeah, the law is, and I was probably going too fast, but
CRPD, for example, I don't know.
Yeah, Demetrius has looked at that quite a bit more. But inclusion in the United States in the federal law is the least restrictive environment requirement. And again, the law requires placement in general education unless their IEP cannot be implemented appropriately. And so that is the law. And again, I like Mitch Yell's term. Least restrictive means most inclusive, but also appropriate. So it's the least restrictive, appropriate environment based on the individual needs of that student. I think that the controversy with CRPD, as little as I think I understand it a little bit, is the same thing I said earlier. Is, does full inclusion mean inclusion in public education? Or does it mean inclusion in general ed in each and every case? And I think that there are a lot of reasons to believe that if it means full inclusion in general ed in every case, or even almost every case, I don't think that that's going to make the kind of progress we're hoping for. Personally, that's my view.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. There is a comment, and you can comment on this comment. The comment goes like, despite the fact that the overall student population appears to be decreasing due to demographic factors, this is the reality in Greece, and other reasons, the number of students with special educational needs who require special education services is increasing.
Mm-hmm.
The second is also a reality in the United States. Would you like to comment on this comment?
Yeah, there are things that are going to affect the prevalence of disability. That's just reality. And I don't know if by demographic you might mean things like poverty and changes in poverty. And there's no question, there's extensive research on the impact of poverty on child development. There's also the impact more so on the severe disability end of advances in medical technology, where you're going to have more children survive, which is wonderful. And so, yeah, these things change. And, I think my comment on that would be, there are a lot of times where special education, and especially when you have people who are hostile to special education, will look at these changes in numbers. And earlier in our history, the number of students identified with learning disabilities increased a great number. And they'll immediately become suspicious and say, oh, we're giving this to too many, kids, and ignoring that these shifts do affect, prevalence. And so really our focus should be, let's ensure that we have the best possible identification of students who may need special education. And then let's do the best that we can to provide that special education to them. COVID was a big impact, and there's been this sort of anticipation that because COVID really, in theory, impacted younger children quite a bit, that we're going to see more students with difficulties that may or may not be disabilities. I think we're seeing the difficulties. I think that in the United States, general ed, we seem to be seeing an increase in kids with social, emotional, and behavioral problems, but they're not necessarily being identified more for special education. There are things that sort of act as barriers to special ed identification, and there's a lot of variability between states, which is another interesting thing, because states vary in how they implement special education, and you get this sort of variability. Demetrius, what else would you say about that?
I don't have something to add to
Okay.
this.
Okay.
Just the last question, actually is a comment.
Okay.
If there is any possibility that this presentation and discussion will be recorded so that the person who asks can watch it at a later time. I think there is this opportunity, will be on YouTube, so they can watch it later. This is actually what happens every time we have these online events organized by DOI, the Federal the Elementary Education Teachers Federation. So on my side, I would like to say it was a pleasure to have you, Andrew, today with us for more than 2 hours and a half, which is a record time.
Everybody. Yeah.
And we hope you enjoyed the experience as much as
Very much.
we did.
I did. It's been an honor. Thank you so much. I hope some of what I said is helpful, and I wish everybody the best of luck.
Okay, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Νομίζω ότι κάπου εδώ μπορούμε να ολοκληρώσουμε. Δεν ξέρω, Δημήτρη, αν θέλεις έτσι.
Ναι, είναι 2,5 ώρες. Ναι, νομίζω πως ναι.
Νομίζω είχε συναδέλφοι και συνάδελφοι, να ολοκληρώσουμε κάπου εδώ. Νομίζω ότι είχε πολύ μεγάλο ενδιαφέρον η σημερινή εκδήλωση. Νομίζω ότι αποτελεί ένα ντοκουμέντο στην προσπάθεια που κάνουμε ως Ομοσπονδία να αναδείξουμε τα μεγάλα προβλήματα της εκπαίδευσης. Και νομίζω ότι έχουν ανοίξει αρκετοί προβληματισμοί, στους οποίους σίγουρα μπορούμε να επανέλθουμε. Και νομίζω ότι στην Ελλάδα, στη σημερινή Ελλάδα, ενός δημόσιου σχολείου που συνεχώς υποχρηματοδοτείται και αποδομείται, η πείρα και από άλλες χώρες και από το τι συμβαίνει, νομίζω ότι μας βοηθάει. Νομίζω ότι πρέπει και με αφορμή τον προβληματισμό που αναπτύχθηκε σήμερα να δυναμώσουμε έναν αγώνα που θα έχει στο επίκεντρο τις ανάγκες των παιδιών, που θα έχει στο επίκεντρο τη στήριξη όλων των δομών του δημόσιου σχολείου που υπάρχουν σήμερα, από τα ΚΕΔΑΣΥ, τα ειδικά σχολεία, αλλά και τις δομές εντός του γενικού σχολείου, τα τμήματα ένταξης, την παράλληλη στήριξη, που όλα αυτά χρειάζεται σήμερα να ενισχυθούν ως προσπάθεια πραγματικής ένταξης των παιδιών και στο σχολείο και στην κοινωνία. Να κλείσουμε κάπου εδώ, υπενθυμίζοντας μόνο ότι οι εκδηλώσεις της Ομοσπονδίας συνεχίζονται και να προαναγγείλουμε την επόμενη εκδήλωσή μας στις 22 του Μάρτη, με ένα εξαιρετικά επίκαιρο ζήτημα που θα μας απασχολήσει όπως το σχολείο και η οικογένεια, στις 29 Τρίτου, όπου θα παρουσιάσουμε την έρευνα της Διδασκαλικής Ομοσπονδίας για τη χρηματοδότηση, και στις 5 Τετάρτου για τα θέματα της περιβαλλοντικής εκπαίδευσης. Να σας ευχαριστήσουμε πολύ. Ευχαριστήσουμε πολύ τον κύριο Βίλι, τον Δημήτρη του Αναστασίου. Καλή δύναμη σε όλες και όλους. Συνεχίζουμε και προχωράμε. Καλό βράδυ.
Καλό βράδυ. Καλό βράδυ.